All right, welcome everybody to today's webinar. We will still wait a few minutes since it's the end of the day for everybody to join. Welcome everybody. For those just joining, we will still wait maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Still see a lot of people currently joining the webinar. All right, we will still wait 1 minute before we get officially started with the webinar. All right, welcome everybody to today's webinar. This is an exposure analysis webinar, the first of its kind on the recent geopolitical events of the political instability in South Korea and the Chinese export ban on rare earth minerals. Exposure analysis webinar because it's about understanding the impact of these events on global supply chains generally, but also specifically for your tier 1 and tier 2, tier 3 supplier base. I'm joined by my colleagues Marco Felsberger, our senior advisor for supply chain resilience, who is preparing the situation reports for such events, and he will introduce them later. And Pyry Naukkarinen, our product manager for the exposure analysis, which helps companies understand how they are specifically affected by these events. Before we jump in, a few logistical points. So the webinar will be recorded, and we will share both the recording but also the slides of the webinar with you in the follow-up email after the webinar. You also have the Q&A section as part of this webinar, which we will always have an eye on. We will have a Q&A at the end, but you can already ask questions during the webinar. If it makes sense, we will get to them or then answer them at the end of the webinar. And so without further ado, let's dive in. We have a packed agenda for today. We will start with a short introduction into the topic. Then Marco will introduce the two topics of today: political instability in South Korea and the Chinese export ban on rare earth minerals, but also give a broader overview of what the advisory team at Prewave is doing on providing situation reports and the global supply chain impact. Then Pyry will give an insight into the exposure analysis with Prewave, understanding how companies are actually affected by these events. And then we will end with an outlook on future topics, as well as a Q&A at the end. So to jump in, today's topic is about supply chain disruptions and particularly geopolitical events. We have recently, over the last year, seen many such global supply chain disruptions, black swan events like the pandemic, but also the Baltimore Bridge collapse, which we consider black swan events, so things that were really not foreseen, but also have sometimes a global, sometimes a more regional impact, but certainly significant. On the geopolitical side, the conflicts in Israel and the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, escalating trade wars, but also natural disasters like earthquakes, also the recent floods in Central Europe, but also Spain. And today's topics, which we see as additions to the geopolitical topics are the instability in South Korea and the rare earth export ban. And these types of crisis situations can have an enormous impact. For instance, we have some examples here. We have still the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Companies are being sanctioned. Why is this a disruption risk? Well, because imports into the US can be flagged by the Customs Border Patrol. Until today, more than 3 billion US dollar worth of shipments have been detained by US Customs. And this is, of course, an immediate supply chain impact. But also then today's topics, China finally banning the export of certain critical rare earth minerals to the US, and also the instability in South Korea. These are topics which can have enormous impact. The question for our customers and companies then is always, how does this situation actually affect my supply chain? And for that, we provide exposure analysis. The exposure analysis works by highlighting certain exposed or problematic suppliers in the deeper supply chain, your tier one, but also the deeper supply chain. For the UFLPA, for instance, we might see here a exposed company, so a company that's on the sanction list or the entity list, as it's called, on the tier two, providing here a tier one supplier, which would mark this tier one supplier as red and directly affected. Here we have a tier three supplier, and the tier one supplier is only indirectly affected, meaning they are sourcing from their tier two. Instability in South Korea or the rare earth export ban, all of these are cases where we want to understand how do these situations and events affect our supply base. And this is what we achieve with the exposure analysis. We follow here a multiple step process from the situation. The first thing that we provide, and this is also the first thing that we will present today, is the situation report. This is a report that's prepared by our advisory team, and Marco will present today the situation reports as they pertain to South Korea and the Chinese export ban. These are general reports, so they are not specific to one or the other customer supply chain, but they give a general overview of the event and its global impact, which materials are affected, which regions are affected, which transportation routes are affected, giving a general overview and giving a broader context to the incident. After that, we provide to our customers exposure analysis. This answers the question for our customers: how are their suppliers exposed to this crisis situation? So identifying and prioritizing the exposures within our customer supply base. And this is a dedicated dashboard and report, which we will also show later during this presentation. And this then leads into the mitigation part, where after a first validation, our customers and companies can then work to mitigate these exposures by finding alternative sourcing routes, diversifying supply, and so on. And to get started, we take a first look at the situation reports. And for that, I hand over to our senior advisor for supply chain resilience, Marco. Please show us the situation reports and what you're doing there.
Thanks, Harald. Thanks for the introduction. The previous situation reports. I've been in charge for those reports since I started in May, and they basically cover events of a certain size, of a certain impact. So we have some measures in place, like how many targets are affected, are important logistics hub affected, are some bottlenecks affected, and so on and so forth. And based on this first analysis, we go into the report and say, okay, whatever the event is it a natural disaster, is it geopolitical tensions, as we have the topic today, or a cybersecurity event like it was for the CrowdStrike incident in the summer, we will create such reports. And the reports are based on general analysis and general data and enriched with Prewave data at the end. So it will not replace the alerts, of course not, but it should enhance the context. It should give you a bit more background to the issue, and very importantly, it should also give you an outlook and a risk assessment, what you can expect, what will happen in the next days. Are there ripple effects? What are the potential cascading effects, especially when we look at situations where ports are affected, for example. So this is the baseline of the reports. And this is what we cover in those reports. And at the end, what you will get via email is the situation report for a certain event, for a certain topic. Yeah. Thanks. This is the latest one. So this is the report, or the reports. We combined them to one for the geopolitical tensions and the trade war in China-US trade war. And here you see the rough structure. So you will always have an executive summary at the start, key takeaways to be informed quite quickly at the end, and then we dive into details and look at the affected logistic nodes, affected areas, affected supply chains in general. And if you could go one side further, maybe, yeah. And if available or if applicable, we also give you an outlook what would be potential cascading effects to other ports or other logistics hubs, to give you to enhance your decision making at the end and give you a good overview for your next steps and for the next decisions. Thanks. Yeah, and the latest reports were about South Korea and the Chinese export ban on some critical minerals. I will dive into that in a few slides. But of course, we covered already a lot of other topics. From the port strike, we had a quite extensive report with certain updates. And yeah, all the events I mentioned before, from natural disasters to man-made disasters, will be covered in detail then. All right. Oops. So before I dive into the current situation in South Korea and in China, I just want to give you a bit of a background and pull back the curtain, so to say, a bit. What kind of thinking goes into these reports? How do we analyze it? What is the methodology behind that? And especially for geopolitical risks, that's a certain kind of risk where we have to approach it a bit differently. And there are three main factors affecting geopolitical risks. Of course, there are many more, but if you have to boil it down and summarize it, it's those three. And basically, the most important one is the geography of a country. The geography of a country defines a lot because it's an immutable factor. It depends if they have certain rare earths, raw materials, access to oil, to energy sources, up until if they have access to the sea, to the coast, and can ship easily, both economically but also military for military purposes. And this, of course, the geography, because it's so immutable, shapes the strategy and the economic, the military and the economic strategy of countries. The second big factor is the economy and the technology itself. Of course, developed good technology base helps countries in many areas. They are technology leaders, meaning other countries rely on them for certain technologies. Think of China and 5G and Huawei, for example. This brings an own kind of thinking with it. And they have a very own leverage point on that as well. With a good economy, they have enough resource for funding, like the military and other endeavors, like getting involved in mines overseas, buying shares of other mines where they have not too many access to, for example, for raw materials in their own countries. And of course, as we have seen lately, especially in the Ukraine war, technology is also an equalizer. If you think of the drones the Ukrainian military used, it is to a certain extent, it equalizes or levels the playing field in many areas. And the third factor we have to consider when we think about geopolitical risks is the military power of a country. So of course, that's a deterrence factor, that's a security factor, but also a factor to enforce geopolitical goals on many levels. And this is all we see, especially in China, or what is going on with China and the US in that cases. Yes. So if we have to look at the dimensions for geopolitical risks, there's first and foremost the economic risks. Everyone is aware of that. We have seen them now in China with the trade war. We have sanctions. We have another escalation level like trade wars, currency wars. We are now at a further stage with resource control, where China said, okay, we now ban completely certain minerals, critical minerals, as exports to the US. These all are escalating step, which we have to think of when we look at geopolitical risks. And of course, there can be intentional supply chain disruptions as well. Think of the Houthi attacks in the Bab al-Mandab Strait, for example, which cuts off the Suez Canal. Another dimension here is the military and defense risk, starting from proxy wars over conventional wars, and again, what we see currently with Russia, the nuclear deterrence, for example. Another important factor is the cyber and technological risks, and there we focus especially on cyber warfare, as well as the cyber physical attacks on critical infrastructure. This is what is very important for the supply chain perspective again, because if they target with a cyber attack certain ports or certain critical infrastructure, starting from I don't know, water supply over hospitals, this makes a difference. Of course, and it manifests itself in the physical, in the material world, that there is the transition from the cyber to the physical part. Yeah, then we have the environmental and resource risk, a thing we will see much more often in the near future, unfortunately, due to the developments, and where we have the access to basic things like water, and so on and so forth, which will be on the agenda, or is already on the agenda for certain countries in regards of geopolitical risks. And then, of course, we have the governance risks as last example here, which we have seen in South Korea, where regime changes take place, or where the governments set certain actions which could then increase or decrease the risk for our supply chains. So, yeah. To make the transition now from the general perspective of geopolitical risk and of that background to our supply chain risks, I always like to start with this picture, because it's the basics of what we have to think of when it comes to supply chain risk or resilience management. It's bottlenecks, it's choke points, it's the weakest link in the chain, so to say, which is a predetermined breaking point, if you like. And you have to take care of those weakest links first, because they will bite you at the time, and most of the time, and it's not when you're prepared. Yeah, so we have 7 of the big choke points, maritime global choke points here, for example, which are very important, of course, for our supply chains. I mentioned already Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandab Strait. You see how easily it is disrupted. May it be a ship, the Ever Given, which blocks the Suez Canal, or the Houthi attack with drones. It's not too expensive to interfere with those choke points, and it has severe implications for our supply chains. So this is what we take into considerations as a thought experiment. But it's not only that. Of course, it's not necessarily a logistic hub or logistics bottlenecks. It's also the critical raw materials concentration. Everything we need to produce, to manufacture in this world has a certain concentration risks due to the globalization and the economy of scale. That was what we are up to the last 20 years or 30, 40 years or almost to. And the issue is that most of the critical materials, and we looked at the 23 critical raw materials from the European Critical Raw Material Act, are located or are mined at least in China, or further than produced in China or refined in China. I will come to that in a few slides, why that is important. But we also see we have different other dependencies on Russia, on Congo, on South America, and This is all for different critical raw materials. And the important thing and the important message is to bring back the analogy of the chain, and the weakest link is we have to look at those issues before the event. We have to be proactive with it. We have to think of which risks could play out how and where they affect my supply chain. And then importantly, where can I do something? Where can I deleverage? Where can I set mitigation measures? Yeah. Now, this was a rough overview about a few key points. What we do when we try to create the situation reports, when we try to analyze supply chain and supply chain risk. And now I will already dive into the South Korea events from last week. And in this area, has been happening a lot, and in the case for South Korea, it was on a very short time frame. So we are on December 3rd last week, and at roughly 10 p.m. South Korean time, the President Yoon convened the emergency cabinet meeting. Half an hour later, or 30 to 40 minutes later, he already declares the nationwide emergency martial law. So that was very quick, very impactful, and a lot of people, especially in South Korea, but also other allies like the USA and many people in the supply chain were very nervous about it, and that's rightly so. Brief short spoiler alert. I will come to that in a few slides. Why? Yeah, and already at 11 p.m., the police blocked all entrances to the National Assembly, and they started to put in place the martial law. Yeah, and on the night from 3rd December to 4th December, they proceeded with that, and already at roughly 1 a.m. in the morning, 190 lawmakers in South Korea signed a declaration demanding the repeal of the martial law. And of course, the South Korean population were on the streets, and there was some riots is a bit too much of a word, but they protested and demonstrated accordingly. Yeah, and at 4:27 or 4:30 a.m. in the morning, President Yoon announced the repeal of the martial law. So it was there very quickly, and it was repealed also very quickly, which is good because it prevented further turmoil in that area. Yeah. On the next day, then. The usual stuff after such events is taking place, like impeachment motion was started, the resignations were handed in South Korea. There is that's almost history there. They have a history with these impeachments. I will come to that on the next slide. But the process was started, and as a coincidence, so that was not a result of the martial law declaration, but on a coincidence, the Korail railway in South Korea started striking on December 5th. So this was already announced a bit earlier. But as you see, risks tend to cluster, and if you're not prepared for the one thing, you're certainly not prepared for the other thing. And when it comes to the scenario before that was okay. There is this martial law. No one knows exactly how they will be able to produce, how many people will still go to work, and what would this mean for the supply chains. So this was resolved more or less, but then we had the situation that the railway and subway was on strike, indefinite strike, and this will affect supply chains as well. Not immediately, not as much as the martial law thing, but at the end, if we have too much of a backlog, you can imagine that hurts us as well in that area. Yeah. I give you a bit of a background, what went into the situation report, into the analysis of South Korea, and yeah, first and foremost, the Indo-Pacific region was very alerted. So they're always alerted. They have a bit of a PUT situation there. Neither one of the big players wants an escalation on the Korean Peninsula. US, China. is not, they see no advantage at this point if there is some kind of escalation, same as Japan and Russia. So they try to moderate a compromise there. And this is, of course, on the tensions are, of course, very high, and it's a fragile compromise. But it is a compromise. It would have been much worse if one of these parties are actually interested in escalating that. Neither the South Korea, which is backed by the US and Japan, nor North Korea, which is backed by China and Russia, was interested in that. That's a good thing. Yeah, I briefly mentioned before that South Korea has a history with these impeachments, and that's also something we have to incorporate or think of and put into the report, into the risk assessment for the report. That wasn't a very new thing. So this martial law wasn't not so much of a black swan, because I think the last 10 presidents, if I remember correctly, were already impeached and or imprisoned, and some of them even sentenced to death, and almost no one could finish their official period there. So except the last one before Yoon. He was the first one who was in office until the end. So you have to take that into account. It's not too new for this kind of situation. Is not too new for this for South Korea. Yeah. And then we have to transition that the general context, the general background to the industries at risk, and how do we do it? We use public available data as well as our Prewave data, and the industries at risk were most and foremost automotive industry, semiconductor industry, textiles, and the heavy industry. And for the reason, I'll go to the next slide. This was one of our exposure analyses already done a month ago, because the risk was identified, and this was something we offered, where we said, okay, look, there is a high risk in the Korean Peninsula. What would be the impact of an escalation of this conflict? And our analysis showed that 50% of the global exports of nitrile rubber, for example, comes from South Korea. We saw that the textile and apparel industry is very dependent on South Korea, and which is always a trigger for a lot of interest is the semiconductor industry as well, and 34% of the exports for memory chips which are used in semiconductors are as well from South Korea. So that is why many supply chain experts were, of course, rightfully a bit under tension, I would say, and looked and eyed this situation there very closely, because it could have had a severe effect on our supply chains. So that's the wrap up of the South Korean events. I want now to look at the next big thing, which was almost at the same time. So it was a busy week indeed. The Chinese ban on some rare earth minerals. And you will get the situation reports afterwards, but you can read it in detail. But I'd like to give you a bit of a context here as well. What happened and when, or what happened in the past, and when this escalation path started to gain traction here. Yeah, and in 2018, President Trump back then enforced the first tariffs on China, worth roughly 50 billion US dollar, and China relatively quickly retaliated these tariffs and put tariffs and export restrictions on soybeans and beef and other things. So you see already that's a theme you will see for such kind of situations. Quite often is that there is some kind of tit for tat. So if there is an action set from one side, there is a very good chance that the other side will react and retaliate in some way. So this is also important if we have an outlook, if we make a risk assessment, to take that into consideration. What could be next if if a certain party sets a certain action. Yeah, in 2019 it was a bit escalated again by Trump. It was they added I think 200 more products to the tariff list at the end. It was roughly 200 billion in tariffs what they were looking at, and there was another dimension, I would almost say, to it, because Huawei was first set on the blacklist. And if you remember back then in Canada, the CEO of Huawei was arrested. This was also very new. That was an unprecedented step, to be honest. And you saw already that there is some escalation going on. Yeah. China reacted in the way that they say, okay, we will ban rare earth materials. Back then already, they didn't do it or didn't enforce it like they did now. But again, you see, it's the kind of tit for tat what we're looking at. Yeah, then came COVID 2020, 2021. This escalated the mistrust even further. You remember Trump, who was referring to COVID-19 as the Wuhan flu and so on and so forth. There was quite again a new dimension in communication, in the mistrust and everything happening. Yeah, in 2021, then I guess it was already President Biden invoked the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and that again heightens the tensions for the relationship between those countries. Interestingly, Biden didn't revoke any of the tariffs or kept most of the tariffs which Trump placed still in place, and even went a step further. As we see here, I clustered the events from 2022 to 2024 because it gained some motion. Let's put it that way. There were more events there happening. The most important one in 2022 when the US restricted the chip, also semiconductor exports to China. And as an interesting detail, maybe, so China, of course, is very important for raw materials and the first refining steps and so on and so forth to produce the semiconductors. They also produce a lot of semiconductors, but not the very advanced ones they need for high-end applications. So they are still reliant for that one on the US or on Taiwan and those countries. So this restriction hit China really hard, and as a retaliation, then later they brought into life the export controls for gallium, germanium exports for global markets in 2023. So we saw there again the first impact on supply chains. So this was just a licensing process, more or less. The government had to give the okay for exports, but it delayed the process. And I think back then the gallium prices or gallium and germanium prices, I think it was gallium, soared by 200% or something like that. So you feel the impact of such events quite quickly. Yeah, and in 2024, that's the reason. One of the reasons we are here in December. They invoked the ban, the total ban for exports of gallium, germanium, and antimony to the US. So this is the next level in the trade war, if we like to call it that way. We will now have a look how much of an issue that is for global supply chains. Because when you do your research and look into the supply chains, you will find different numbers and figures how much each country is exporting and importing, and there are different figures because there are different phases. And I tried to visualize that for the gallium supply chain, and we have. As a first step, we have the raw material mining, and of course, in the mining phase, China especially is very strong. So we will look at the charts later, but China almost have 98% of the global exports, which was mined, which was mined in China. But then. We have to go one step further, and we look at the next step of the gallium, and this is the high purity gallium. And there the exporters are still China, very strong in processing and refining those ones. But the gap closes a bit. So then the countries like Japan and Germany and United States are already a bit better prepared to support their own market or other markets with that kind of gallium. And yeah, this goes into electronics, LEDs, photovoltaic cells, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and then there is one step further as well. That's the gallium compound exporters. That's the GAS and GN, where China still do a lot for it, but they're already Japan and Germany and the US and Canada is much closer in producing the same numbers. And if you look, for example, at the import statistics for GN, I think it was from the US. Import to the US from China, you saw that it's only 4%. So they are not very reliant for that on Chinese exports here. Yeah. And that's what we have to look at. We have to disentangle a bit the supply chains and look at it and see, okay, where would we have a problem and where do we have a real problem, and are the numbers we see in the research to put them somehow into perspective then. Yeah. And the last step is the recycled gallium. So we from the step before, from final products more or less, countries like Japan, Germany, United States are very strong at recycling. So they get rid a bit of the mining part here. That's another factor why it's maybe not immediately felt, and they can have a bit more of a soft landing maybe. This plus what is also an important information is that the US have strategic stockpiled rare earth materials. That's a factor why even the bans or the restrictions back then in 2023 didn't have a lot of impact on the US overall. So that's a bit to set into perspective how we have to dissect such kind of analysis to come to a good conclusion in the situation reports. Yeah, and last but not least, I just wanted to show some charts here with the top exporters worldwide for the minerals which are banned now by China. And we see here that China is on 3 stages for antimony, for example, quite strong. So mining, refining, and manufacturing. You see also that countries like Belgium, Japan, Germany, USA are getting better when it comes to the refining part, to the processing part, to the manufacturing part. They're closing the gap, but still there is same as for gallium here, China very dominant in this area. Yeah, and the third mineral which is banned now is germanium. There's the picture. The picture is quite similar. And yeah, these are also things we take into account for such analysis. Yeah, and last but not least, what can you do then? Once you have the I would say the macro perspective, the context, you get a bit of a risk assessment and some analysis which supports your decision-making process. You would go into the Prewave platform. You look up the companies when you hopefully have mapped them with us already. You looked it up. And see, okay, what are the top US importers, what are the top Chinese exporters, and you can translate all these analyses down to your supply chain and see where you would be affected. And based from the reports, they would go then into the risk exposure library. And now with this, I would hand over to Pyry to show you a bit more how it looks in how it looks in Prewave and what you can do with Prewave here.
Perfect. Thank you, Marco. And hi also from my side, everyone in the webinar. So wait a second, I'm just checking if the remote control works. Yes, it works. All right, perfect. So I'm a product manager at Prewave, and I'm working on all of these tier N related topics. And as Marco already pointed out, I would next like to show you how we're basically then taking this kind of macro information into the Prewave tool and putting it available to you on really the company level to then help you evaluate the effects for your particular supply chain, and not in this big picture, which is of course very important to understand first. But then when we really get to the your supply chain, then we need to get to the company level as well. And the tool and the concept that we are using here to basically help you with this analysis is something that we call exposure analysis and exposure libraries. And the idea is that essentially we put together data sets that you can use to analyze your exposures or your connection to specific risk events. So kind of what Marco has now talked about. So these export bans for China or the South Korean situation. And on top of that, allow you to basically skip the tier N mapping part. So the part of figuring out the suppliers of your suppliers and their suppliers in several tiers of the supply chain. And how do we do that is that we basically construct data sets from what we call bottom up. So in maybe a normal scenario, in a tier N scenario, what you would do is that you would start from your own tier 1 suppliers, then start going down from there to figure out who are their suppliers, and then on the third tier, their suppliers. But what we can do is if we go from the other way around, that we have some group of risky companies, and then we start looking at who are their customers, then we can basically construct the data set that you can then, as we've written here, overlay with your supplier base and see then in the scalable and fast way where the suppliers, your suppliers have potential overlap with these risk companies. We're currently classifying this basically in two kind of categories we call standard risk libraries, where we take some public data sets and add this tier N component to them, as well as curated libraries where we essentially enrich this publicly available data with Prewave research, such as what Marco has just been describing, to make sense of these big data sets and pick the companies, pick the kind of industries or verticals which are relevant in the first place. Well, we then have the data put together. We can have a picture that looks something like this, that you would have your company there and your supplier base, and kind of also bringing or like connecting this back to what Harald mentioned in the beginning, that we have some of these risky companies in the supply chains that come from these libraries that are then somehow connected to your supplier base on the tier 1 level. If we briefly have a look at the kind of type of data that we use to make these data sets, to put these libraries together, we could imagine it something like this, that we have these what we call exposed companies in the risk libraries, and then we look into different various data sources in publicly available data, such as customs data, different sort of media data, kind of news articles, could be declarations by companies who are their most common suppliers, and we have a predictive model as well, which basically makes probabilistic statements of who are likely to be suppliers of other companies where there might be gaps in the other data sources. When we then look at basically this case that we're not talking about, the South Korea and the China case, these libraries look something like this, that in this China case, we would essentially have lists of companies as these exposed companies who are top Chinese exporters of the commodities whose exports have now been banned to the US. So companies exporting antimony, gallium, germanium, and also taking this proactive approach here. So we can also include then companies that, for example, export graphite out of China, because this is a material that we foresee based on the trade patterns, in the sense that they are like highly concentrated in China, and this is something that US needs. So it would be kind of a natural candidate for including on such a list in the future. In the South Korea, we have a similar approach. So what Mark already mentioned, we have these cases like, for example, South Korea had a large share of global exports of something like nitrile rubber or semiconductor memory chips. So we would have Korean companies in this library then who are exporting these products out of Korea. How does the tool then look like in Prewave that we use to do this analysis? I will explain, let's say, a bit of theory, and then I will jump into the system to show you how it actually looks like. But basically, we have a new area in Prewave where you can start an analysis and then define your parameters for it. Before you will then get an overview of what is the impact on your supply chain in the format of a table. And finally, you can then dive into details into each of these tier 1 suppliers to see, for example, when have the shipments taken place, what products exactly have been shipped. Before I show this in the Prewave system, I will still show another slide on what we are going to do there next. What are we working on to basically take this feature to the next level and make the data that we get from there even more, let's say, tailored to your particular supply chains for your products. When we look at the publicly available data, the case is there that we are, let's say, we will only get to a certain level of granularity. So if you look at, for example, the customs data, we will be relying on the level of the HS codes that we can read in this data. And of course, if you in the end want to be 100% sure that an exposure that we find to something is relevant for your products, we need to get down to the parts level, as we call it. And therefore, we are currently building there, let's say, an extension to this exposure analysis where you can engage with your suppliers directly in the Prewave platform and send them what we call validation requests. So say, okay, I'm buying from the supplier a particular product, and ask them more information to validate basically this information if the relationship that has been found in the public data is really relevant for the product that you are sourcing from them. And the suppliers can then answer this request in a portal, therefore helping you basically enrich this publicly available data with, let's say, private data or shared data raised from the supply chain, which will in the end then enable you to make smart diversification decisions. So you can be sure if you do some kind of, let's say, you would do some reconfiguration in your supply chain, that you are making it based on really the data that is specific to your products and your parts. Before handing over back to Harald for the outlook, I will still show a demo in the system, how it looks exactly in the tool. I think I need to give up this remote control so that I can share. Now I should be able to share my screen. All right, so now I'm in Prewave, and we have here a section called Terrain Explorer, where the user can define an exposure analysis. So, and in the exposure analysis, the first step that needs to be done is an analysis needs to be configured. So basically there the user can name an analysis and then define the most important parameters are basically what we call the base collection. So that's the group of companies that would typically be your, let's say, tier 1 suppliers or some subset of your tier 1 suppliers. And the exposed collection is then basically these risky companies that you are looking to find in your supply chain. And this example that I have prepared here, we are looking at now some of these nitrile rubber exporters out of South Korea. And in addition to that, the user can define also kind of the conditions under which the supply chain is constructed to connect these two data sets. So we could, for example, say what I have now done here is that because we are looking at a sample of tire suppliers, that we only want to see suppliers there who have something to do with the tire supply chain, essentially. So if we would then find companies in between the supply chain who are, for example, shipping some non-production materials, we would not see them in the network that we are looking. Once the analysis has been configured, we will then land on a page where you can essentially see an overview of the supply chain or of your tier 1 suppliers on who of them has connections to these risky companies, sorted in a way that the one who has the most connections on the closest tier will be sorted on the top of the table. So here we can, for example, then see that Bridgestone is on top of the table here. We can see that on the tier 2, looking from your perspective, tier 2, so their tier 1 has connections to 4 of these companies in the other collection, and on the tier 3 level 5. And if you would then be interested in seeing this in detail, like where do the, for example, the connections come from in terms of like which of the connections in this risky companies dataset they are connected, we can see it, for example, by clicking the row of Bridgestone, that here we have, for example, a relationship to a company called Kumho Petrochemicals, and there have been various like this kind of synthetic rubber articles shipped. We can see, for example, in the year 2023. And this will be true for all of the relationships that we can see here. We can always inspect them in more detail, or, for example, clicking one of them, we can then highlight all the paths how this one company will or is connected to the company in question that you are inspecting. I still want to show another example just to basically highlight the flexibility of this tool in the sense that we can use exactly the same process to then select just essentially different parameters. So instead of now looking at the South Korea case, I selected here as my base collection, basically a sample of automotive suppliers from the United States. And then to take this proactive angle as well, I took as an exposed collection then like top Chinese exporters of graphite, because this is something where we foresee this might be subject to some future restrictions. And after configuring the analysis, we can then go through basically exactly the same sort of steps that we can get the overview and see how many, for example, we can see then on tier 3 level here, 4 of the 18 suppliers that I had in this sample are so-called exposed. And we could again look into this similar kind of detailed view if we so want to. And the final thing that I wanted to show is that basically what I mentioned earlier in this one slide about these parts level requests is essentially that we can then, what we are now building on is a functionality that you can select suppliers from here. In this case, I selected all of the suppliers where we found the so-called exposure and add it to a request list, which then means that I have selected now the 4 suppliers here, and I can see, okay, I'm working with Adient in Battle Creek, and I know that I buy from Adient a car seat. and I could then here send a request to AD basically stating that we see in this data that you have a connection to particular companies which we think are at risk for this and that reason. And can you confirm that basically the parts that go into my product come from that supplier, or do they come from another supplier? So this is then the type of mechanism that you could use to take this public data to the parts level to make it really specific for your supply chain and your products. That's it from my side. Thank you. I'll now hand over back to you, Harald, for the outlook.
Thank you, Pyry. Thank you for the demo. So now you have an understanding of the crisis situations at hand and how you can also analyze your supply chain's exposure to these crisis situations. I already see or saw two questions which were going into the outlook scenario. So what is now next and how can we look more into the future also with scenarios? So let's dive into that. So first of all, what can be next? Yeah, in order to understand in an escalating trade war what could be next, we need to look at which materials the US has a high dependency on China with. And here we focused on some materials for the automotive and manufacturing industries. You see here on the size of the bar is the value of US imports in million of dollars. The line you see here, this is actually more relevant, is the share of US imports from China with that particular material. So for instance, aluminum oxide, which is used for finishes, but also for spark plugs, there's close to 50% share of imports into the US coming from China. Even higher is the share with electromagnets, so certain rare earths that function as electromagnets, but also manganese, which is used as an alloy for steel, but also within batteries. And so here we see a view on some of the materials which in an escalating scenario could be next for bans. And we also want to give, let's say, a word of caution on the diversification. So what you see here is a chart of the foreign ownership of the mineral supply in certain countries. For instance, China has actually a significant ownership stake of mineral resources, for instance, in Africa, such as the DRC, but also in Peru, for instance. And this is actually, of course, the areas where many of these, particularly here you see battery minerals, are originally produced. So diversifying outside of China could mean you are still dealing with a Chinese-owned mining company. So to sum up, you saw here the three-step process from crisis situation to mitigation. We presented our approach on the situation report, giving you a general understanding of a crisis situation. The situation report, which we presented today on South Korea and the Chinese export ban, will be provided as part of the follow-up mailing to this webinar. The exposure analysis is what Pyry presented and demoed. This is where you can look for the exposure specific to your supply chain. Here we can offer you a demo. You will also be able to request such a demo in the follow-up mailing. And yeah, what's next? And there was also a question about that. Of course, with the change in administration, and I think 21st of January is the inauguration date. And we already heard that on the first day of office, the new administration will bring additional tariffs. That means an escalating scenario. And that's why we are already working also on a report that we have currently called Trump tariffs. And we're also planning a webinar a week before inauguration date give you also an overview similar to today on what we see as additional impacts globally, and again, how we can offer you to drive this analysis within your own supply base. And also to answer a question in this particular webinar, we will dive into the scenario analysis capabilities, which we use to drive kind of a proactive approach. So not reacting to a crisis, but actually trying to identify what's next within the Prewave system. And with that, we want to say thank you. 1 minute after 6, so on time, when we still have time for some questions. I see one additional question because the one on the scenario planning I already answered, which maybe Marco, you can take. So given the political instability in South Korea, chemical and pharmaceutical production, are they still operating regularly? Do you have any insights? Is any production shut down currently, or are they producing still?
As of my information, they're still producing, and only thing we follow is the rail strike, which could have an impact, but it's still limited because I think they operate still during business hours to up to 70%. So it's not a full strike, and there could be delays in various industries, but nothing mentionable now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, we can still give 1 or 2 minutes for questions. We still have more than 50 people here in the webinar. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A section. And there is one. In relation with the app or the website which you presented to calculate risks, can you please share with us the direct link? Yes, so we will share afterwards in the mailing for this webinar, the follow-up mailing, which will go out either tonight or tomorrow morning, an ability for you to also request an exposure analysis and be able to download the report, as well as the recording and the slides that you saw today. What are the top risks identified for 2025? Maybe I go first, and Marco and Pyry, you can think about it for 1 minute. So clearly we have the trade escalations on the map currently, and we see, let's say, the trade situation to escalate from different scenarios. We have compliance topics and which are kind of guided as let's say trade escalation, such as the UFLPA. We have trade tariffs escalating as it comes to the automotive industry in Europe and in the US. As you know, the automotive industry is under pressure from the electric vehicles produced in China. As the pressure increases economically, we can also anticipate further tariffs, which can again lead to retaliation. And of course, we see the, let's say, the situation with the new administration in the US, where we can already clearly foresee additional tariffs and potential retaliation. And what we see and also presented today is that this retaliation can be quite specific. Yeah, so we can anticipate that China, for instance, will retaliate with specific materials where they have a export or close to an export monopoly. Yeah, but maybe passing the board to Marco or Pyry if you see additional scenarios for next year.
Yeah, there are many, unfortunately. I think it's also important to note that we will be dragging many of the current issues to 2025. So the Indo-Pacific tensions, as you mentioned, same in Middle East, Israel, Iran, and Syria, and so on. So we have many things going on currently, which will keep us up on our toes in 2025 as well. Yeah. That was just my brief addition to that.
Another topic maybe, which is currently, let's say, more of a European and maybe even a Central European question, is rising financial stress in the supply chains. Because as we see, let's say, the order and production volumes decreasing from the OEMs and large manufacturers, that trickles down into the supply chain, and that leads also to layoffs and additional financial stress. This is also a topic we are heavily supporting with partnership with Coface, for instance, who can provide us insights also proactively into the financial health of suppliers. But this is also a topic which we see, at least in the next 6 months, still escalating. Yeah. There's another question. Are all the analyses based on information available in public, or are there classified information that is used? I think we can answer this is based on public information. Even the data that we use within the Prewave system is a public trade data sets. So we have here on the one hand bill of lading data, which gives us insights into hundreds of millions of shipments. These are customs shipments, but this is public data. And we have a data set on globally on import-export volumes based on HS codes. So for certain customs codes, materials, what are the import-export volumes between countries. And these are data sets that we use then to drive the specific analysis you saw today. Does Prewave pick up cyber supply chain disruptions? Yes, this is part of the more than 150 risk categories that we are monitoring and scoring for our customers. So the answer is yes. Is it possible to add new suppliers as per the customer's need? Does the software allow to add new supplier? Yes. So when you come on board in order to conduct such a exposure analysis, for instance, you want to know what is my exposure to rare earth exports out of China. Then what you would need to do is you would set up your tier 1 suppliers in Prewave. This can be an upload through Excel spreadsheet, or you can add it in the tool. It can also be an API, but for, let's say, fast analysis, we would recommend the setup for Excel or manual. And then that's already enough with access to the exposure analysis. You can then already check in your tier 2, tier 3, and beyond what your exposure is. And that is because we have bottom-up mapped these risk libraries that Pyry demoed earlier. Last question, are there any specific sectors or industry that you have more coverage on? Let's say we have a very strong customer base in manufacturing and automotive, but let's say broadly defined, that would also include chemicals and food and beverage, manufacturing, electronics, household appliances, automotive. That is the customer base that we have the broadest footprint in. But that is not really impacting the analysis that we are doing in terms of data that we have at our disposal, because the customs data that we use, also the analysis that Marco is doing, is, let's say, industry independent and is not using the data we have from our customers. Of course, when we produce certain charts or analysis, it is with a certain focus, for instance, on automotive or manufacturing. But that is something that can also be broadened in the future. Yeah. All right. So thank you very much, especially to my colleagues Marco and Pyry, for preparing the situation reports and the exposure analysis. You will receive the follow-up email, as I mentioned, either tonight or tomorrow morning. And then let us know if you've had additional questions. And we hope you enjoyed the webinar, and hope to see you next time for the Trump tariffs webinar on January 14th. Thank you very much.